Welcome back. Today we will start on chapter 15, which is on psychological disorders. I'll start with a question because it's actually a really hard one. What is a mental illness? Let me know your thoughts. And what does it mean when we say that somebody's mentally ill? The DSM-3 considered homosexuality to be a mental illness. And so Myra suggests they're acting in a way that's not socially acceptable. To some extent, mental illnesses, the label that something is a mental illness is socially constructed. There are different syndromes. Syndromes are constellations of traits or behaviors. For a very long time, it has been observed that there are people who hear voices that other people can't hear. They see things that other people can't see. They speak in ways that are really hard to follow. And let's call that a syndrome. But what that has been labeled as historically has changed dramatically over the years. Back in the days of the ancient Greeks, the oracles saw things and heard things and said cryptic things, and nobody would make a.
I'm sent to geckos. I might crop it.
Sorry, someone has their microphone on.
There. Well, I was there for the.
Luke isn't listening. So throughout history, that syndrome has been seen in different ways. To the ancient Greeks, there were oracles who looked an awful lot like that, and nobody would make an important decision without first consulting the oracle to hear the cryptic thing, because that is an important prophecy. At other times in history, we might have seen them as possessed by demons, as having a divine connection. If there's a religion out there that isn't yours, you don't believe in it, it probably involves some type of a religious figure who heard voices, saw things, burning bushes, etc. In that religion, they're not psychotic. In that religion, they're not schizophrenic. It's actually a divine experience. But across the different religions, these experiences seem sort of similar. At other times in history, we've seen that as a medical problem. We might wonder if something's caused by a disease. Is an illness, can it be cured? Today, we might call that schizophrenia. So there is, what's real is the syndrome, the set of behaviors and states and traits that clump together. They're identifiable. That's objectively real. But then the decision that something is a mental illness, that it's kind of wrong and should be treated and cured, is socially constructed. And it's not completely arbitrary. There is an idea at the heart of it that whatever this person is doing is maladaptive. I'm going to look at your comments now. So Myra has that kind of socially constructed view. They're acting in a way that is not socially acceptable. Sarah says, I've been told that it's some kind of chemical imbalance in the brain. That's an interesting idea, because do we know what the chemical balance is supposed to be? Is there a fact sheet somewhere that says this is the chemical balance of an ideal brain? It's supposed to be, I don't know, 20% fat and 30% protein. And it's supposed to have these neurotransmitters at these places, at these levels. There's no such thing. So that idea, that hypothesis of chemical imbalance is an idea. And it makes sense to some extent. We know that in schizophrenia, there's something going on with dopamine, and antipsychotic medications target that and seem to work. So maybe there's something to the chemical imbalance story. But at the heart of it, there's no kind of clear-cut objective definition of what a mental disorder is, because there's no clear-cut definition of what mental order is. Is somebody with ADHD mentally disordered? I don't know. I mean, that hunter-gatherer that we saw at the beginning of the year in that video, he seemed really distracted all the time, and yet that behavior was very adaptive in his situation. Maybe not in today's classroom, but that's not his environment. So can you see that the label that some syndrome is a mental illness is ultimately socially constructed, even if it's about syndromes that are objectively real? So you can look at sorry, somebody has their microphone on and is talking and is not listening and having a conversation with somebody else, and I don't know where that's coming from. If you could please turn off your microphone if you are not participating in the class. Thank you. So you do know that I record these, and so if you have your microphone on while you're doing something else, it comes through on the recording, and I can't easily edit that out. Back to your chats. The chemical imbalance view refers to a certain kind of model, and that's the medical model. In the medical model, the mental illness has some kind of a biological cause, chemical imbalance, something else, and there could be a medical way to fix it. There's a pill for that. So that view comes from the medical model of mental illness. Liam says that for something to be a mental illness, the person should be mentally unwell. But what does wellness mean? There's actually an answer to that. If your mental health is when you realize your abilities and you contribute to your community and you get through cope with the normal stressors of life. So let's say they're not doing that, they're not functioning, and it's long lasting and it really stands out. Grace says a mental deficiency that causes certain behavioral differences or certain holdbacks with performance, whether it's social, mathematical, behavioral, etc. So mental, it's something in your head, something psychological. It's different from whatever we think is normal. And we think that whatever it is maladaptive. It's not working in certain contexts. And these are all reasonable. So we tend to think that mental illnesses are atypical, that like most people are normal. However, that's not like a sufficient condition, or maybe even a necessary condition for calling something a mental illness, because mild depression is not statistically rare. In fact, it's quite common. There are atypical profiles. Synesthesia is atypical. That's when people can like taste smells or see, hear colors. That's not considered a mental illness. Synesthesia can be quite useful. Helps people pick out certain stimuli more easily. But there is an idea that mental illnesses aren't normal, right? That most people aren't mentally ill. Another idea is that mental illnesses cause distress subjectively. The person is suffering. They're suffering from this condition. Well, Let's think critically about that. Some conditions do cause people to suffer, right? Depression causes a person to suffer. A person suffers because of their anxiety. However, there are psychological conditions that we don't like that don't cause the person to suffer. Somebody who's manic isn't suffering. They feel like they're on top of the world. However, they could be doing things that are very harmful to them or to other people in the long run, right? Going on spending sprees or becoming very promiscuous, for instance. So subjective distress could be a component, but it's like not a necessary or sufficient component. Also, some people, psychopathic tendencies aren't bothered by that. I mean, Ted Bundy wasn't bothered by what he did. We think that it involves some kind of impairment. I think that gets at the idea that it's maladaptive in some way. There's something about this that isn't working. There is definitely, I think what's very key is that there's a social judgment that this is not okay. This is mental illness. I'd say that's probably the one like foundational criteria, because all mental illnesses, the label that something's a mental illness is ultimately socially constructed. And then there could be as well some level of biological dysfunction. Practically anything psychological is simultaneously biological. If I just move my arm, there's something going on in my brain. There's something going on, and certain parts of the brain are becoming activated. Neurons are firing. Neurotransmitters are being released. And maybe there can be dysfunctions in that process that cause mental illness. There's something going on with dopamine in schizophrenia, in ADHD, right? Maybe if the person with ADHD who only wants to do what they're interested in is getting some kind of a dopamine hit from what they're interested in. So you can see there's all these different factors that contribute to something being seen, to some syndrome being labeled as a mental illness. But at the end of the day, it's always a social judgment. And our decision that something is or isn't a mental illness has varied over the course of history, because different societies have thought about the same syndromes in very different ways. So sometimes, there have been theological understanding of mental illnesses. Maybe that problem could be caused by a demon spirit. And then what we think is the problem influences the solution. If we think that this condition is caused by demonic possession, well, what do? Right? You have to get the demon out and do an exorcism. Or maybe punish or banish the person that is possessed by a demon. Right? Maybe the person's a witch. They're having some kind of relationship with evil. Now, let's say we think that what they're doing is good. It's not exactly the demonic model, call it a theological model. You could think that this person had a special connection to the divine. So the oracles of the ancient world sounded kind of schizophrenic to me. They weren't seen that way. They're seen as having a special connection to Apollo. And any religious leader that has walked in a desert and had visions and heard voices is also seen as having a special divine connection, or maybe being divine, but that's not seen as a bad thing. It's not a bad demon. It's, the spirit of God is in them. Right? When think about people talking in tongues, they're seen as being kind of having some, is it the Holy Spirit in them? So this can be seen as like depending on whether you think the behavior is inappropriate or appropriate, you can see it as being a demon or as being some kind of a good spirit or God. Those are theological explanations. The medical model started emerging in the Renaissance. That's the idea that mental illness is kind of caused by biological, physical reasons that need a medical treatment. The medical model of mental illness is associated with, in terms of its historical development, associated with thinking about syphilis. So back in the day, before there were condoms, before there was STI screening, syphilis was very, very feared. And syphilis, as it advances, actually affects the brain. And neurosyphilis results in all kinds of psychological or psychiatric problems like depression, like psychosis, you name it, because it's making your brain swell, and what goes on based on what happens is based on what part of the brain is affected. And syphilis, people were very afraid of syphilis, and they knew it had something to do with sex, and so there was all kinds of moral and religious ideas about it. And at one point in like 1912-ish, it was discovered that this illness is actually caused by it's a bacteria. Maybe it's a virus. It's a bacteria. So the agent was identified, and not much longer after that, like maybe within about 10 years, the cure was discovered too. It could be treated with penicillin. And that got people thinking about mental illnesses as having a potential physiological cause that could be identified and treated. Now, what do you do with somebody who's sick? You give them medical treatments. Where do you do that? A hospital. And so now you have the idea of a mental hospital where people are going to be treated, right, by doctors for the mental problems. The asylums were supposed to be nice places where you would put your patients to get better. However, institutions can actually be very nasty places. They're often overcrowded. Right? Many of the people who were in there would be from marginalized backgrounds, understaffed. They don't really know how to treat the people who were there. So what do? Eventually, you're locking them in cells, putting them in straitjackets, chaining them to the wall. These places got quite ugly. They would do things like try to bloodlet. There was an idea at one point that maybe this mental illness is caused by having too much blood or blood of the wrong kinds, and let's let some of that off. Obviously, that's not a scientifically valid treatment for mental illness. Sometimes try to scare people out of their conditions. Could you shock somebody out of this by putting them in a pit with snake? So all kinds of things happened in these asylums that made the idea of it being in an insane asylum not very desirable. Things got so extreme that reformers started intervening. Moral treatment is the idea that mentally ill people should be treated with dignity and respect and kindness. That's an improvement. I mean, think about how much worse you're going to make things if you're treating people, you're heaping shame on them, you're being disrespectful and cruel to them. Right? That's not going to make the condition any better. So even though kindness itself is not a cure, it makes things more decent. So there were reforms that meant people were treated more decently, but they still weren't getting the right treatment necessarily. Now, I think I put that picture on the wrong page. A big step forward was the development of a drug called chlorpromazine. Probably mispronouncing that. Thorazine is easy to say. Came out in the 1950s, and it was an antipsychotic agent. And that was a huge step in the development of psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. And now, with the use of this antipsychotic drug, people were so much better that they could even go home. They could keep down a job. They could function more normally. And with the advent of better and better medications, people are asking, well, why are we spending so much money on these mental health? You can imagine it's really expensive to house somebody in an institution, because you got to pay for the building, you got to pay for everything to keep it running, you have to pay for the staff. That could be a lot of money for a government to be paying. Oh, wow, there's these pills that make people better. Why don't we just hand them a prescription and let them go? Save a lot of money that way. So many former inpatients were released and hospitals were closed. And now there's the idea that the person's going to go to an outpatient clinic. Okay, so take this medication and come see us at the clinic every 3 months. And we'll talk about any issues you have, adjust the dose, etc. Is that good or bad? Well, it depends. There are, advocates for freedom. Living in an institution could be dehumanizing in any ways. But it also backfired, because many of the people who were released actually didn't have the skill or ability for self-care. Right? Maybe they don't trust the medication. Maybe they don't think they need it. Maybe they forget to take it. And now what do you have? A very large percentage of people who are homeless, who are living on the street, are people who have mental illnesses. And you might say, well, what about they're drug addicts? They're using drugs. Well, sometimes they use recreational drugs because they're trying to self-medicate an underlying condition. So, mixed results. There are efforts to address the problems, things like mental health centers, right? Halfway houses where people can have supported living, they can have assistance without being an inpatient, without being institutionalized. So there could be a level of support provided versus just kind of basically cutting them loose. Mental illnesses are socially constructed, and there are some interesting differences across cultures in mental illnesses. There are some mental illnesses that are much more biological, and we see them cross-culturally. Those two major conditions are schizophrenia, it's been observed cross-culturally, and depression. And those have, probably bipolar disorder too, those have strong kind of biological antecedents, causes. There are some mental illnesses that seem entirely socially caused, right? Caused by social contagions that are really culture bound. In eating disorders are quite localized to the West. And it's in the West where young women get bombarded by messages that they should be thin, to be beautiful. Not a problem in Mauritania. So eating disorders are culture bound. They're more culturally determined. And you see very big differences in prevalence rates and even in the qualitative nature of eating disorders between societies. Here's other examples of culture-bound condition. There's I wonder if hikikomori is the right word. No, it's not. That's the wrong Japanese word. There's a sort of Chinese, Japanese phenomenon where people work so hard that they die at their desk, like death through overwork. Not something we have around here, but it's a recognized condition in Japan. In some parts of the world, people might believe that there's a condition called koro, where people believe that their genitals are like shrinking into their bodies. And here, a man is providing treatment for koro through an exorcism. There are conditions that are talked about among, say, Inuit or among different indigenous groups that are not conditions that occur in the mainstream. Here's I think this is another Japanese condition. Fear of offending others by saying something offensive or giving off a terrible body odor. Makes sense that this could come up in a more collectivistic culture where people are concerned about what other people think of them. So there are many mental illnesses that seem culture bound, that are more kind of sociologically determined. And then there are some that are more biologically determined that appear to be universal. Now, this slide is as is from the textbook. And as I was reviewing it, I thought, maybe we should think critically about some of these claims. So your textbook lists misconceptions about mental illnesses. Some people might say, okay, it's just putting people into boxes. That is true to some extent. However, the boxes of mental illnesses do allow for diversity in the condition. So depression has core underlying features. To be diagnosed with depression, you have to have, let's say, low mood, and I think another one is loss of interest in activities. Right? Everyone with depression has that. However, there's many other symptoms of depression, like difficulty eating or sleeping, like overeating or oversleeping, and not everyone with depression has them. And so the criteria will say something like, okay, for it to be depression, over the last 2 weeks, you must have had 5 of these 8 symptoms and definitely these particular 2. But there are so many permutations of that there could be like 16,000 different ways that depression shows up. So yes, it is a box, but it's a bit of a bigger box than you might imagine. And Liam says there are several types of depression with different symptoms. Yes, so there's like major depression, there's dysthymia, there's trying to look for the word for chronic depression, but I think it might be dysthymia. Anyway, or there's like postpartum depression, but there's still boxes, right? So they have different diagnostic criteria, and there's wiggle room within those boxes and those criteria. The textbook says that it is a misconception that psychiatric diagnoses are unreliable. I don't really agree with that. There isn't 100% reliability on psychiatric diagnoses. You've probably experienced this yourself if you've gone to different psychologists or psychiatrists and they've diagnosed you with different things. I've had many diagnoses that other people don't agree with. There are, when it comes to these really severe disorders that are very biologically based, there's a lot less disagreement. So if somebody is, having full-on delusions and hallucinations and is showing the major symptoms of schizophrenia, there's not going to be much argument about that. But there could be a lot more argument about whether somebody qualifies for, let's say, something like depression or anxiety. Right? There's some diagnoses that are much more subjective. Now, ADHD is something that is easily diagnosed and misdiagnosed and overdiagnosed. So psychiatric diagnoses are certainly not 100% valid all of the time, but it's also not true that there's zero validity. If you're being, very sad and not getting things done, and it's been like that for a long time, you probably end up with some kind of diagnosis about depression, but which one it is might vary. And there could be somebody that says, well, this seems to be a normal grief reaction to losing your mother recently, and so that's normal. That's not depression. So some conditions involve more subjectivity in the diagnosis. The textbook says that it is a misconception that psychiatric diagnoses stigmatize people. And they say that according to labeling theorists, psychiatric diagnoses can exert powerful negative effects on people's perceptions and behaviors. Few different things going on there. A psychiatric diagnosis itself doesn't cause stigma, just like homosexuality itself doesn't cause stigma, just like being Black itself doesn't cause stigma. There's a group of people who are engaging in stigma based on that diagnosis. Kind of like saying that being fat causes discrimination and bullying. No, it doesn't really. There's a group of people who have a value system, who are making a decision or going along with a culture that involves stigma, discrimination, or bullying. Now, another issue is that maybe being diagnosed with something could make you think or act or feel in a different way, and that could be unhelpful. So let's say you start seeing yourself as a depressed person because you get that label. Could that make you see yourself in some way that's maladaptive? What if you said, well, I am a depressed person, so I can't do this or I can't do that. Now I have autism, so what if I say, well, I can't have a full-time job because I'm autistic, and autistic people can't do that. There's some way that if you were given a label, you could misuse it. And I'd say that a label is a tool, and any tool could be misused or used in a way that causes harm. And I think that goes for medication, right? Medication can be helpful, or you could be on the wrong medication or you could overdose on it. But I would actually agree that yes, a label can be used in a way that's harmful. Right? Let's see if you anchor yourself to something because of this identity. And so you act in ways that are less flexible and adaptive because you've anchored yourself to this. Sure, I'll buy that. So what I don't love about the way the text has presented this information is that they've done a straw man thing and a way to set up straw man arguments and then taken them down. And I feel like, I don't think that's exactly what the critics are saying. And in fact, there is some merit to the criticism. There are proposed criteria for the validity of diagnoses, right? A good diagnosis should distinguish a person who has the condition. Right? It shouldn't mix them up with people who might have other conditions. There should be distinguishing. A diagnosis should predict people's behavior. If I say that somebody has ADHD, you should see that come through in their behavior, come through in test scores in some way. If somebody is given a diagnosis and there's some hereditary component, we might expect to see a family history. A diagnosis should provide information about prognosis. My mother has she has Parkinson's disease. One of the first things I wanted to do was look up the prognosis of Parkinson's disease to understand the natural history of Parkinson's disease. Natural history means what happens in the condition over time, right? Let's say if untreated, you leave a person with a condition like that, what happens? What happens after 5 years, after 10 years? What are the stages? Oh, there's early stage, there's middle stage, late stages, late stages. So what do I need to do in order to ensure her care that helps me? Okay, so that diagnosis should lead to or provide information about prognosis. And it should also suggest treatments. When my mother was undiagnosed, we didn't know what to do with her. Okay, she were trying to make her eat more food. My dad took her to get acupuncture. We didn't know what to do. However, when it was known that she has Parkinson's disease, it suggests that there are certain treatments she should be getting. She should be on Parkinson's. That's helpful. However, there are many disorders, labels, mental illnesses in the big book of mental illnesses that actually don't meet these criteria. Some do, some don't. There are many different disorders in the Bible of clinical psychology, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's like the Bible of clinical psychology. And it lists all the disorders and symptoms and the criteria and how a person shows up in order to qualify for a diagnosis. And these diagnoses are grouped into different classes. Like there's psychotic disorders, there are mood disorders, there are personality disorders. So here's an example of diagnostic criteria. So you don't kind of look at someone, they seem sad, and say, oh, you have depression. There's a list of symptoms of depression. And for somebody to qualify as having major depression, they have to have 5 of these 9 symptoms for at least a 2-week period. And then they must have either depressed mood or what's called anhedonia, loss of interest in things that they would usually do. Okay, so you gotta have these, one or the other, and then you need to have at least 5 altogether over a 2-week period. If you have 4, not 5, then sorry, you don't meet the criteria. So that's the box, right? There's an in the box, and in the box can look many different things, but there's also an outside box. So you have all of this, and it was only 4 symptoms. That doesn't meet criteria for depression. Sorry, you don't have depression. And if that was only going on for 1 week, it's also insufficient to make a diagnosis. You could have these symptoms and they don't cause you significant distress or impairment, right? Like let's say you have the depressed mood, but you're chugging along, you're sticking a smile on your face, and you're okay with that, and you keep going, Now it's got depression. If there were manic or hypomanic behavior, it suggests that this isn't the right diagnosis. Maybe you'd look at bipolar disorder. I'm not asking you to memorize this. My point is to say that the book offers formulas, procedures for diagnosis. And it offers an important level of standardization because all the psychologists are using the same book. And so when they talk about depression, they know what they're talking about to each other. And when they write papers on depression, they're talking about this. It makes it less shifty and subjective. So this book contains the criteria, the rules for each condition. If you think you might have a condition, and remember, you're not sort of qualified to self-diagnose, let's say you think you might have ADHD, you can go and look up the DSM-5 criteria for ADHD and think about it. Be like, oh, do I do that? Does that apply to me? And then if you feel like that might be a fit, you could go and ask your healthcare provider for a referral or an assessment. And then technically they're the only ones that are allowed to make that. And the DSM-5 also contains other important information, like on the prevalence of a condition. Prevalence is the percentage of people within a population who have a disorder. And a lot of that is based on diagnostic criteria. If you loosened up the criteria, the prevalence rate for the condition would increase without anything else going on. But if you made the criteria more stringent, like let's say, oh no, it needs to be for at least 3 weeks, all of a sudden you'd reduce the prevalence dramatically without anything else. The prevalence rates are quite dependent on definitions. So, not all diagnoses in the DSM meet those criteria for the validity of diagnoses. Okay, this is not all based on scientific data. It has this categorical model. Either you have it or you don't. There's no subclinical depression. You don't meet the criteria, you're not depressed. So it's kind of black and white. When maybe it might be more useful to look at it as a continuum, right? Like, hey, let's say you saw depression not as a disorder that you'd categorically diagnose yes or no. What if you saw it as a continuum and you could place somebody over there and say, okay, that's maybe pretty high or higher than you want it to be. You can see that the DSM itself, for all its sort of objectivity and seeming sort of scientificness, also is a product of its times. Because ultimately, mental illnesses are socially constructed. Your textbook talks about a mental illness that was discussed in, was it like the 1800s? And it was about like slaves who wanted to run away from their masters. They were definitely a mental illness. I mean, you should be happy with your master. And some of the treatments involve things like, like flogging. And can you see how the idea that something is a mental illness is still very sociologically grounded? Anyway, you can see that over the years, the way the DSM talks about homosexuality and gender has changed a lot. Okay? In the 1950s, homosexuality was a sociopathic personality disturbance. Okay? It didn't stop being a mental disorder until 1974. You had a new category, sexual orientation disturbance. It's still a mental disturbance in the 70s. Okay. And now, as things get later and later, you see it's becoming more about the distress. So sexual disorder, not others specified, can include distress about your sexual orientation. Well, is your distress because of the orientation or because the climate, the society in which you have that orientation? The DSM-5 is up to, I mean, it doesn't have homosexuality as a mental disorder anymore, but it looks at, has gender dysphoria as people who have significant distress with the sex and gender that they were assigned at birth. It's still pathologizing queerness. It's about the distress now. So technically, if you're not distressed about it, you don't have gender dysphoria. So it could be okay to be just androgynous and non-binary. I had a friend whose mother worked in a psychiatric hospital, and I enjoyed having her tell me stories about what that was like, probably in the 1970s-ish in Cape Breton. And she told me about a man who was so depressed, and she'd tell me about the extent of his depression. I remember at one point asking her, well, what was the cause of that? Why was he so depressed? And she answered, because he was gay. Is it the homosexuality that's causing the distress or the depression? Or is it really the way his homosexuality is constructed in his community, right? Is he seen as broken, disordered, being dangerous, being a failure? And maybe that is what results in the distress or the depression. So I wanted to leave you with that as an example of how this book is grounded in time and place. And even though it's come a long way in terms of LGBT identities, it's still a lot further behind than many LGBT advocates would like to see. It has a very pathologizing view of neurodiversity. If you read the DSM-5, you won't see anything positive about ADHD or autism. It takes a very kind of negative view that these are disorders and these are problems, and these are all the ways that it's not a strengths-based perspective. That it's 12:20 now, so that we're at time, and I think this is a good break point. Are there any questions before we end for the day?